what I want to do is I want to make a number of points about the popular period of the 1980s, but I make these not out of a nostalgia towards the 1980s, but because we have to ask ourselves, what does the popular politics, if it was a popular politics, and I must argue that, what does the popular politics of the 1980s tell us for today? What is the reason why one should place weight on that form of politics? And it would also then bear on the practices of Abahlali, baseMjondolo, amongst others, and also something that is missing, perhaps, in the politics, official politics of the present. Now, I say this against the background of academia, which is incredibly dismissive of the idea of popular politics and dismissive of all manifestations of it without empirical evidence, or in their case, without presenting empirical evidence, or without a correct representation of the evidence that does exist. And there's quite extensive evidence of the experiences of the 1980s. And there's a tendency also to blur distinctions between the popular, the populist, and xenophobic forms of mass activity. As if they all form one thing. And it goes back to something in history where the masses are viewed as something that is contemptible, equated with a rabble, unthinking people. And if you look at Raymond Williams's books, the keywords, it's quite a useful discussion of the etymology of the word masses. And I think this is also related to academia being primarily a white academia who had studied the masses in the archives, and they were very comfortable with the masses in the archives. But in the 1980s, the masses came, and for intellectuals like myself, who had read about mass creativity, for the first time in my life, I could see the masses that you read about in books. Now, I was excited, but there were others who were very fierce and scared of what they saw. They didn't like, they had believed that the people should govern. But when signs emerged of the people exercising their own power, many of these people got very scared and unhappy. And in fact, one of them has actually confessed this to me, that when he heard me present on this in 1986, I said to him, were you not actually afraid about what you saw? And he admitted to me in private. Now, I only treat the 1980s in this paper, but I'm doing this because I believe it has international significance, in the sense that internationally we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by democracy? The word democracy has come to mean representative or so-called liberal democracy, when in fact the origins of the word democracy was one of direct popular action, whatever the blemishes and aspects. And it was displaced. The notion of democracy as direct action was displaced in history. And we have to ask ourselves whether we've got to accept this as the only way in which we find expression as people in our country and in other countries, and it has meaning for a number of countries, and there have been a number of attempts to have some meaning beyond going on the vote. Now, before I draw lessons from this period, which in some ways may qualify what Michael said in the beginning, I want to contextualize this because I can't assume that you understand, know the context in which the popular power period arose. In the 1960s, which I would argue, from 1952 to 1965, I would argue is the only period that the ANC as an organization has been hegemonic as an organization in South African history. Now, that is something that is not the way the history books are written. They are written in a sort of teleology, and from the early rise of Jambavu and a number of other missionary educated Africans, everything is leading towards the ultimate culmination of African National Congress hegemony. My argument is that in general that's not true, but it's especially not true of the 1980s. Although the relationship between the ANC and the UDF is complex, it's one other illustration of the lack of ANC hegemony by virtue of a lack of direct organic contact with the people with whom it purports to have this special relationship of leadership. When people talk, okay, when we look at this period after 1965, when the ANC had been crushed within the country, which is not to say ANC did not exist, PAC didn't exist, not everyone went to jail, and underground structures continued to exist, but they were virtually invisible. Now, in the mid to late 70s, the Black Consciousness movement appeared on the scene, but in the late 70s, there was a revival of organizations which formed part of what's called the Congress movement, people who identified with the symbols and the principles of the ANC and its allies. They organized themselves not as the ANC, but in a number of sectoral organizations, traders, workers, sports organizations, women's organizations, a number of these. By the late 1980s, you were seeing acts of defiance like the ANC flag being raised. And this is something I will come back to about the UDF not being the ANC, but nevertheless, there's a relationship that has to be unpacked. But in the early 1980s, it was decided that they would make an attempt to unite all these organizations in what became the United Democratic Front, whereby a number of organizations, it became 600 or more, eventually representing probably 1 or 2 million people. And that front was established on a limited basis to oppose certain pieces of legislation, but in practice it became a broad-ranging attack on apartheid. And it was a broad-ranging attack on apartheid and a mobilization, the organization of people on that basis, but it was simultaneously different from a purely political organization because the UDF was sectorally based. It represented shopkeepers, traders, craft people, etc., etc. It's a very important thing that you can't equate the UDF phenomenon with a straight political organization. Now, many people, when they praise the UDF, praise it because it had features of accountability which are significant. Now, when I deal with popular power, I'm not placing weight primarily on accountability because accountability is an important feature which is translated into constitutional rule. I want to concentrate on the feature which is not translated into constitutional rule, the question of self-activity, self-empowerment, popular direct democracy. Now, from about 1984, the level of resistance against apartheid, in particular against local government, Bantu authorities and Bantu administration systems reached a level where the ANC issued a call, make apartheid unworkable, make South Africa ungovernable. And throughout the country, police and Bantu administration department officials were driven out of townships. And I will note in passing, what is significant about this is that ANC in exile had developed increasing contacts with what was happening in the country, so that its call was able to be implemented by people inside the country who were in the UDF but considered themselves loyal to the ANC. But ungovernability by the UDF leadership and by the ANC outside and inside the country was not seen to be desirable as a continuing state of affairs, to have sort of a state of chaos and failure to govern. And there was a call made to establish elementary organs of people's power. And people acted on this. Now, when the ANC issued the call, they were not able to dictate how it would be implemented. It was an idea that came from the ANC. People inside the country had their own ways of implementing it. Establishing street committees which would develop consensuses about how to deal with local problems. In Port Alfred, one of the most significant areas of popular power, people brought Grahamstown to a halt after a domestic worker had been raped and the employer had been let off on bail, and they started to build popular power there. They drove the Bantu administration department out of the area and they established a creche in the area. Now, what was interesting about Port Alfred as a case study is that in very many cases of popular power, there was extensive use of violence. Okay? This happened primarily when the leaders were arrested, all of that. But let's take Port Alfred as a case which worked for much of the 1980s. You had the organization of the community of Port Alfred on a cross-generational basis. It was not the youth alone. You had civic organizations, women's organizations, trade unions, school scholars, and youth, all coming together in what was called the Central Committee. It's interesting, the language, by the way. Central Committee in Port Alfred. If they wanted to have a consumer boycott, they would make a decision which was made by people who represented people from street committees, from block committees, but from different sectors that represented different categories of people within Port Alfred. And you'll find a similar thing was happening in Uitenhage, in Attridgeville. These are some of the places I must have studied or interviewed people on in the period. Now, when there was going to be a consumer boycott, I remember traveling down to KZN with a comrade, and you didn't know where there was a consumer boycott, and he would say to me when we were going to buy something, he would say, make sure that we only buy things that are edible, because they will make you swallow whatever you've got, because we didn't know where there were consumer boycotts, and there was a state of emergency, and then if we had cooking oil, we would have to swallow it. So, but what was interesting about Port Alfred is that if they had a consumer boycott, they didn't enforce it through violence. You would have a little boy in a tree who's saying, Auntie, where are you going to? There is a consumer boycott now. Where are you going to? Or there's a strike. Where are you going to? So what was interesting about the period of popular power is that we can have a typology of some situations where it worked. Now, Michael, in his one article, which is a very important article of 1998, has made a periodization of the UDF and popular power period. And one of the significant moments is when the states of emergency are declared, they arrest primarily the older people, and the youth tend to be more impetuous, but also there's an infiltration of Tsotsi elements. In some cases, Tsotsis had been around in any case, and more use of violence. I did a lot of work on what I called popular justice, which didn't necessarily mean courts. It meant often mediation in communities. In the period of the state of emergency, when the older comrades were arrested, you had extensive use of kangaroo courts where people were beaten and all sorts of things like that. So what we can see as the popular power period emerged and then started to degenerate is that there was, it was a moment when the reported representatives of the community tended to have a narrower base, no longer representing all sectors of the community. The organizations that had previously come together were no longer there because they had been crushed. So you have a situation then where, as Michael shows in his article, they banned the UDF and all these people are arrested, and what is called the MDM, the Mass Democratic Movement, emerges. Now, many people equate the Mass Democratic Movement as the United Democratic Front, but they're not the same, because it's in fact COSATU, South African Council of Churches, and one or two others, acting on behalf of the masses, not having this organic link that you have during the popular power period. So that is the background to the rise and gradual fall. Although you still have street committees in many parts of South Africa, you have had some that have actually emerged since 1994. But the context then was of a crisis of apartheid, whereby it was made ungovernable, and organs of popular power were established, and people reinterpreted the Freedom Charter's first clause, the people shall govern. I was quoting last night how Weza Maze said to me, a man from Newton that what we are doing now in our street committees is implementing the first clause of the Freedom Charter. By that statement, he was reviving the original meaning of the word democratic, that the people would directly rule. But simultaneously, he was committed to what was called the transfer of power to the people through his loyalty to the ANC and ultimately seeing democracy also as being universal suffrage. Now, we have a number of questions that arise from this period. One is, what was the exact relationship between the ANC and the UDF? And people like Govan Mbeki and others say basically the UDF was set up by the ANC, they took a decision, or alternatively the ANC underground ran the UDF. And I think the answer to the question of the relationship is not to say it was totally independent, or that was totally absorbed or totally a part of the ANC. A lot of UDF operatives saw themselves as also being ANC operatives. Now, there's this famous quotation from Marx in the 18th Brumaire where he says, people clothe themselves in the garb of past generations. The UDF had a sort of, not an inferiority complex, underestimated what it was the significance of what it was doing itself. Consequently, it clothed itself in the garb of the 1950s as reviving the 1950s. So the UDF, one of the ways the UDF claimed legitimacy for itself was as picking up the spear that had been dropped with the crushing of the ANC in 1960 and seeing itself as a part of the ANC. And I think that did not mean, as I indicated, that they did exactly what the ANC intended. Now, when the ANC called for popular power, it was in Lusaka. When the UDF leadership called for popular power, it was in its head office and was a coordinating body. Jeremy Sequence's book does not deal with what happened on the ground. And when people on the ground implemented popular power, they took their own decisions about how they would implement it. They used their own creativity. There's a Sudanese novel where a chap goes home and he looks at his relatives and he says, these are the people that they call peasants in books, his own relatives. Now, what I, as an intellectual, saw then was people doing things. Everything that you read that the masses were capable of doing, they were actually doing. And we had no idea in the UDF leadership, and I'm sure the ANC leadership had no idea that they would set up people's parks or a range of other creative activities of controlling their own lives. I think, however, that people like Gail Gerhardt in the From Protest to Challenge Volume 6 go to the opposite extreme in suggesting that the ANC in exile had no influence. What actually happened is when the ANC issued its January the 8th statement, activists in the UDF would read these very carefully, because those statements had the genius, if that's the correct word, to be able to speak to people in a number of sectors. And we say to the youth, we say, set up organizations in a number of territories. The northern Transvaal area has been neglected. Let us make this a liberated territory. To the students, we say, to the women, we say, etc. Then they would declare a year to be the year of the youth. In the year of the youth, hundreds of youth organizations were established. So it's very important to understand that the ANC at that period had a sense of what was possible. And when we in the UDF, I was in the UDF leadership, when we wanted the school children to go back to school, we failed. They went to Lusaka, and when they came back, the ANC issued a statement saying, go back to school, the school classrooms are your trenches. Now they knew the language that would appeal to the school children. We may say, okay, it's very bad that they use militaristic language, but the ANC had a pretty good sense at that time of what would work. Now, they didn't stay in there permanently, but at least they got them back for a while, and we didn't have, the parents who were incredibly concerned did not have the language that could get them to do it. Now, the UDF, as I say, was on the one hand very respectful of what the ANC said, but it was not a surrogate of the ANC. It tended to underrate. When the UDF ultimately dissolved itself, it dissolved itself because it saw itself only as a B team that was a curtain raiser before the real team came on the stage of history, at which stage they would dissolve themselves. They did not understand adequately that even if they had a loyalty towards the ANC, they were also simultaneously doing some things that had never before been done in South African history in a number of territories, some number of areas that didn't appear on the maps of South Africa. In some of these areas, you would have these activities. Then, the final point I want to refer to is a theoretical point, which Michael, I don't know if he referred to today. The way in which the UDF operated was not always conscious of the theoretical implications of what they were doing. Yes, Michael did deal with this, but not in quite the way I'm dealing with it. The insurrectionary model placed focus on one decisive moment for which you had to work. At that decisive moment, everything beautiful would unfold. Democracy would happen. You would smash the state. If you were a communist, ideally it would be a dictatorship of the proletariat, but if you were not even, there was a convergence between the Marxist and national liberation models whereby you believed that there would be a moment when there would be seizure of power. At the very least, there had to be transfer of power to the people. When I was asked, at that time, do you believe in negotiations, I would say no. The only thing to negotiate is the immediate transfer of power to the people. Now that notion is an instrumentalist notion of the state. That once you take hold of a certain thing called the state, everything else happens. It doesn't understand, and we're learning this now, that the state is not a thing or an instrument, but a series of relationships that need to be transformed. But the more dangerous problem with that notion, which the UDF experience managed to displace, is that it doesn't place sufficient weight on everyday struggles. The only struggle that matters is the one for the apex, to take power, as if it's a thing. And Kossatu, in his own practice, had already shown through making shop floor gains that you could make gains before that decisive moment. Now, what is interesting about the mindset, the consciousness of people in the UDF, there was a coexistence of a seizure of power instrumentalist notion and simultaneously working for day-to-day structural reforms and gains and self-control in their own communities. That was semi-final. The final point I want to make, and I've got 10 more minutes anyway, but the final point I want to make is that one of the features of the 1980s, and it's something that we need to grapple with today, is intolerance. And intolerance relates to the national liberation model, that there was one organization that was the sole and trusted, I can't remember the language, sole and legitimate representative of all the people. And consequently, there was a lot of intolerance of black consciousness. It was mutual, but I know from the point of view of the UDF that there was a lot of intolerance. There was a lot of provocation of intolerance, like this Reverend Makina down here in Port Elizabeth, who TRC has found was a military intelligence person, but there was definitely a sense that if someone did not want to go along with the Congress movement, the UDF, the so-called Charters, one of the legitimate ways of addressing it was to go beyond persuasion and use your fists and other means. Now, what I think it requires of us today is to problematize the notion of pluralism. Maybe you can use another word to encapsulate that, but I think when we try to recover our democracy that is under attack at the moment, we have to ask ourselves, have we got the theoretical tools? Have we got the theoretical tools and have we transmitted them to the population as a whole, whereby people understand that it's legitimate and in fact necessary for every interest group to decide whether or not they want to organize themselves and act in the public arena, politically or in other ways. Now that is not something that is well embedded within political consciousness in the ANC for sure, but in South Africa in general, I think people who want to exercise that right are not sure that they have legitimately got a claim to it. So my summary of what I've tried to say is the rise of the popular power period may have coincided with what the ANC needed at the time, but the ANC didn't set up the UDF, ANC didn't set up popular power. Many of the people who were involved in popular power activities were loyal to the ANC and saw themselves as ANC people. Nevertheless, what they did, ANC didn't know anything about till afterwards in many cases. It is important, however, to not write off the significance of the inputs made from exile, because in very many cases, and people also used to listen to Radio Freedom, so on a day-to-day basis, people would actually be getting guidance, and much of this guidance was on the spot. So it's important not to dismiss that, and not to also see that influence as being as represented purely by military support. So what I've tried to show then is that we need to return to a study of the popular power period. First of all, because democracy should not be restricted in its meanings to representative democracy. We have a case study that can be made of the 1980s. We have in South Africa at the moment some social movements, in particular Abahlali, who are trying to implement forms of popular power. I think we should claim these. We should also develop typologies of what works, and I've indicated broad-based, intergenerational types of organization are more likely to be non-coercive and truly popular. So these are some of the ideas that we across.
I'm going to talk for roughly 20 minutes, and I'm not going to pummel you in the manner that Raymond here did. I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic like Raymond and all these other important people. I'm a medical practitioner, community practitioner. So my talk is not going to be very academic, but I'm going to try to explain to you the period of the 70s in which I was active and what we were doing. We'll go back a little into the period of the 60s to set the context of our operations in the 70s and how we operated in the popular space and how we created our relations with the rest of the people. My origin and the origin of my compadres with whom I was in the Black Consciousness Movement was in a university much the same as yours. The Black Consciousness Movement actually began strangely at a medical school in a medical university. Now, a medical degree, as you might know, is supposed to be a very prestigious degree. Then more than now, especially for black students, being at a medical school was a highly prized and prestigious achievement. And one was not supposed to engage in politics or to rock the boat, having attained such a privileged position in society. You were going to be a doctor, after all, one of a very few species in the community at that stage. How and why it happened there, I don't know, but maybe there are certain reasons. But to give the context, in the 1960s, after the banning of the ANC, PAC, and all the other organizations, they followed a period of extreme repression in South Africa. The events of 1960, particularly the Sharpeville uprising, had sent shockwaves throughout the system. Such shock that South Africa began to be seen in the world as a pariah state. A lot of consequences happened. Lots of white people were beginning to pack their bags, wanting to emigrate. The stock exchange had dropped to its boots, foreign capital flight and all of that. So there was a real scare that the South African state was going to fall. And what happened then was that the international imperialist community came to the rescue of the system. They pumped in money, Chase Manhattan Bank, other banks, Swiss banks, pumped in money back into the state, bolstered the South African state. At that point in 1960, one of the things that had happened was that the then Prime Minister, Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, first of all, was shot and didn't die, and later was, in April 1960, he was shot by a certain. He was stabbed. Before he was stabbed. He was shot. He was shot at the Rand show. And he recovered. But the South African state was in a state of absolute panic. So much panic that even the past laws, which were the cornerstone of the apartheid regime, controlling black movement, were suspended for a period of 2 weeks. They were suspended in parliament for a period of 2 weeks. Verkrampte nationalist ministers in parliament started making some conciliatory statements that black rights need to be looked at anew and so on and so forth. But after that panic, and when the state regained its power, it embarked on serious repression. Serious repression, seeking out everywhere, ferreting for the remnants of the ANC, PAC, and other resistant fighters, generally silencing every voice in the community. Political, church, black people were held in this state of total awe. That is the background of the 1960s, in which which gave rise to us at the end of the 60s. But in the 60s also, as a sop to black people, as a sop, the system created and tried to perfect the system of separate development and established the Bantu stance, the Transkei, Ciskei, Venda, and so on. And these were supposed to be vehicles through which black people could express and vent out their political aspirations. In the urban areas, there were so-called urban boards, but all of these institutions were peripheral to real political power. At best, they could only give advice to the regime. The structure and system of apartheid got really firmly entrenched. It was firmly entrenched. On the side of the resistance, there remained a few voices, largely amongst white liberals, constituted the Progressive Party and other institutions. In the student sphere, the voice that existed amongst white students was the National Union of South African Students and Users. And I say white students advisedly because this was an organization which was largely operating in white institutions, particularly white English institutions. As part of the elaboration of the apartheid philosophy, also black universities were created, TERFLUO, University of the North, University of Zululand, University of the Western Cape, Western Cape for so-called Coloureds, University of Durban Westfield for so-called Indians, and so on and so forth. These were supposed to be universities where the black elite were to be trained in order that they may come to serve their own people. We were at the medical school, and because our medical school was rather unique in the sense that it was a hybrid between an apartheid institution such as the University of Zululand and the established institutions that had existed, like the University of Natal, University of Wits. We were attached to the University of Natal. We were a satellite campus of the University of Natal, and as I told you yesterday, those of you that were there, we were called the University of Natal non-European section. Non-European section. And at that point, we were non-Europeans, and that is what the regime called us, we were non-Europeans. We were affiliated also to the National Union of Students of South African Students, NUSAS. We were the only black campus which was affiliated to that campus, to that association. There came a time, though, when we realized that we had to grasp a nettle and take responsibility for our own freedom. At that point, of course, initially we're not thinking about freedom as a whole or emancipation, we're talking about student struggles. And we started an organization called the South African Students Organization. And through many struggles and many discussions and learning, we came to call ourselves the South African, instead of non-European, to call ourselves black students. And to begin gradually to think about our place in society. And that thinking and search for answers led us to the initial development of a body of thought that came to be called Black Consciousness. Now, if we go slightly backwards, perhaps, ever since the conquest of black people and the seizure of their land, black people have been called all sorts of names. They've been called natives, they've been called barbarians, they've been called Bantus, they've been called Kefas, they've been called Pulis, they've been called Busmans, etc. And it was part and parcel of the philosophy of conquest, that they must be dehumanized, they must come to accept the names that they were given, the derogatory names that they were given. And with time, of course, through this process of being pummeled on a daily basis, people began to accept a negative outlook of themselves. Kind of Pavlovian, if you may say, to be conditioned to daily repression and oppression, exploitation, being called names over that entire period. Even when our people began to attain as a rudimentary level of consciousness and to create their own organizations, they still thought through the eyes of their masters. They still looked at themselves through the eyes of their masters. The early black liberals like your Jabavus, your Khubusanes, still regarded themselves as natives, and they wrote elaborate documents. If you go into the history and see some of the petitions that our people were writing to the crown and to the describing themselves as we, the natives of South Africa, we humble subjects of your majesty, forever grateful for the great leadership of the white people. That's how they regarded themselves. But this is also not surprising. I don't think it was unique to South African people. I think it is a feature of all societies that have been oppressed for long, long periods. So we were also, even at the end of the 60s, we're still caught in that mode of thinking, and we still regarded ourselves as we were non-whites, until we took that quantum leap to call ourselves black. I think that was the greatest quantum leap that black people in this country ever made into a state of new consciousness. If one took the period from 1652 to 1968, which is almost 300 years of being kept in not only physical but mental bondage. This was the first time that black people broke out, even if not fully, but began to take the first steps in breaking out of the mental bondage in which they were. And I think that word black in black consciousness is very pregnant as indicating this breakout out of an oppressive mode. As we grew more and more aware, we brought in the word consciousness. Let me say here that black consciousness was not born in a day. We didn't wake up one day and say we have black consciousness. It was born through a period of learning, questioning, practice, questioning again, interrogating. So we came to call this whole process of our awakening, of our renaissance, a black consciousness. And it is very important that we called it a consciousness because we were talking here about a movement that was awakening a people into consciousness. The conjunction of those two words, black and consciousness, each separately pregnant, but together very, very pregnant, awakening a black people. And also, not a process, as I said, commenced on a day, and not a process with an end. Because it was a consciousness, an instigation or a stimulation of a consciousness of what? A consciousness of self, coupled with the consciousness of self, an empowerment of self, extended to consciousness of those around you, empowering those around you, arousing consciousness in society, and empowering society, empowering black people. So black consciousness is about the arousing of a consciousness in a people who had hitherto been so oppressed and been unable to recognize and understand the constraints in their own environment, the arousal of consciousness to understand what are the constraints in your environment, where they derive from, how they are connected with each other, a consciousness of your own history, your own culture. As a part and parcel of oppression, all of black culture, as you know, was suppressed. In the new oppressive environment, all the symbols of success, the symbols of achievement were white. Everything that was good was associated with whiteness and white people. So the consciousness sought to say, no, but this is not the real way in which the world has been. That there are lots of black successes. The history of black people is replete with heroes, with great successes, with all sorts of things. And this is what the black consciousness attempted to do. And still attempts to do. But as part of that growing consciousness that we had, we took another quantum leap, a very important quantum leap. And this brings us to the question of popular movement. The quantum leap that we took was to recognize that our struggles were not in the university. That they were not in the university. If they were only partly in the university, that our struggles were outside. That the struggles of our people outside the universities were intimately connected with the struggles of the students. And that enabled us to leave the hallowed halls of the universities and immerse ourselves in our... Now, I heard Raymond say, insinuating that actually this was a movement of the 80s. No, this was a movement which we began in the 70s. We began to get out of the universities to create organizations for people, to conscientize people in whatever environment they were in. Whichever aspect of society existed, we went to. We went to the churches, and we carried the same message of black consciousness to the churches, and created organizations with and for them. We went to the youth in the high schools. We created organizations for the students in the high schools. Azanian Students Movement, which you might remember, ultimately gave rise to a man called T.A.T. Mashinini. TECON, the Theatre Council of Natal. Azayo, the Azanian Youth Organization. All in all, we had in excess of 20 organizations that we helped create, all based on the theory and practice of black consciousness, arousing consciousness, but importantly, not usurping the people's struggles, not imposing ourselves on the people's struggles, not attempting to lead the people in their struggles, but empowering them to understand their own struggles. and to be able to connect the dots between one struggle and another struggle. That is what we attempted to do. And this whole effort culminated in what was called the Black Consciousness Movement, which became the biggest movement of black people that this country had seen up until then. The whole period of the 70s, leading up to the early 80s, was a period in which the Black Consciousness Movement predominated over the entire country. I mean, I traveled all over, and I met people that I had never seen, who were local leaders of the Black Consciousness Movement, who'd never been to a BPC office, who'd never been to a SASO office, but who had assimilated the ideas of Black consciousness and been part of the Black Consciousness Movement. And therefore, in 1976, when the student uprisings occurred, the entire country rose in support of the students of 1976. Not only students, but everybody, the working class. Sometimes, well, actually not sometimes, in the new South Africa with the new nomenclatures and so on and so forth, 1976 is named as being a student revolt. It was not a student, it was a national revolt by the people of this country against apartheid. Not against Africans, against apartheid. Which reminds me of what one professor said at Fort Hare during a strike. You know, students in my day normally used to strike for food. I don't know what you guys strike for these days. We used to strike against the catering, standards of catering, food, and so on. And this African professor addressing us says, I know, don't think we are fools. I know you guys will say you are struggling for food, you are striking for food. I know you're not striking for food, you're striking for the land. Don't think you should camouflage us. What I'm trying to say here is that although the trigger for 1976 was Africans in the schools, but the real uprising was against the regime. It was a national revolt against the regime. So I'm trying to demonstrate here how we organize and mobilize the entire population on the basis of the Black consciousness philosophy, and attempted to broadcast the message of liberation to our people. Further to that, because we knew that there had been an ANC, a PAC, a South African Communist Party, we went out deliberately to seek out those people that we knew who had belonged in those organizations, to persuade them to come and join us. So we did not adopt a hegemonic outlook that we wanted to take over the ANC, the PAC, or we wanted all of the people who were involved in resistance to come together. We actually had lots of problems. A lot of people say we're idealistic in that, because we later found out that none of those organizations were prepared to come together with us. Instead, they thought about us as intruders into their space because they harbored hegemonic ideas about who was in control, and they were all victims then of the Cold War. As Raymond was saying, there were phrases like, who is the sole and legitimate representative of the people of South Africa, and the ANC, because it was supported by the Soviet Union, thought itself as being the sole and legitimate representative. But we harbored no such ideas. The important thing here to realize about how we operated in in South Africa is that we operated right under the noses of the regime. We operated inside the terrain of oppression. So all of our methods, all of our strategies were honed on the field. On the field, we did not have the opportunity, nor did we desire it, to be in the Soviet Union or in Angola. We faced the enemy eye to eye on the field. And that gave rise to a very high level of vigilance, because we're operating in a minefield of security laws, security agents. So we had to develop a very high level of vigilance, organizational ability, and also to give our people courage. We developed a high level of defiance. Those of us that were banned, for instance, like myself, we broke the banning order openly. That banning order said, if you're banned, you're not supposed to be in the company of more than 3 people, you're not supposed to be out and about in the streets after 6 and so on. We broke those banning orders openly, in full view of the security police. We got arrested, we went to court, we told the magistrate we don't recognize him, we can't be tried by him, justice can only be meted by our peers, he's not our peer. We did all of those things. When we were arrested in Pretoria, about the same time with Raymond here, we're telling the judge, we don't know who you are, and it was but all of this was done. It was not done merely as drama, nor was it done as a gimmick, but it was done to demonstrate to our people that these people are not invincible. They can be defied, and they can be defeated. The question that was later asked by Raymond here: how did we perceive how we're going to seize power? Because that was our slogan. Black men, you are on your own, seize power by any means necessary. How did we perceive we were going to seize power? That is a question that we did not ask, and which I think became one of the problems that we had, and the weaknesses that we had in our movement. In much as I think the entire black movement had that problem about the seizure of power, how exactly power was going to be transferred to the people. And in our view, we think the 1994 settlement, we were ambushed by the regime and its allies into negotiations at a time when the Black Liberation Movement as a whole was not properly ready, and therefore was forced into a settlement, a neoliberal liberal settlement, a market-oriented settlement, which today constrains delivery to our people. Because today our people are asking, why do we have a government of our own that we've elected, but which is not delivering? It is constrained precisely because the settlement which was made in 1994 was skewed so much in favor of the regime. That's why we have baseMjondolo, we have you guys struggling with your universities and all of the other things that you see. I think I will end there, and then we will leave it to questions. Now, maybe just to add a little further, in the 80s, a lot of our people, a lot of young people who had come from the Black Consciousness Movement, realizing just the enormous force that the regime was using against them and the violence, a lot of them went into exile. And they were the people who bolstered the exile liberation movement, Mkhonto Wesizwe, APLA, and those other. Prior to that, and Raymond, I'm sure, will tell you that both the ANC, PAC, and all of the organizations of our people that were in exile were extremely weak. Up until 1980, they were extremely, extremely weak. In fact, I was told on Long Island by one of my comrades from the ANC that when they were in Zambia in the 60s, and the Russians would ask them for people to come and train, he said we were so few, one year we would send this group, another year another group, in the third year we send the same group that we had sent initially, because we didn't have people to send for training. So we are the most highly trained people. Some of us have trained twice, 3 times, because they were recycling each other. Let's stop there and then we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you. TJ.
Thank you. Very well said by the first speaker and the second speaker. It reminds me of the olden days, not the good old days, but of the olden days. To me, it came to mind that maybe we are going to see a university as an institution coming out of its boundaries into the societies out there, joining the formations of the ordinary people. I mean, we are living in a real world, and we are faced with real challenges. And we need to be very careful in what we do or say. Careful in the sense that we cannot afford to make any more mistakes. Because all of the struggle that you have heard about from the first speaker to the second speaker, it was all betrayed, if I can put it that way, in one year, 1994. Because in 1994, I will include myself in that, we all downed tools, calling it a day, thinking everything is done. Whereas it was the beginning of what we expected. If I can say it in another way, our freedom had just been born. It needed to be nurtured, it needed to be looked after, it needed to be shepherded into the correct direction. But we all gave the power that we have fought for so long to a few who didn't know what to do with it. So it is becoming more clearer that we are justified. When I say we, I mean the grassroots. We are justified in saying, we are waiting for you guys to come, join us, understand the struggles from below, because that is the only way we can take this country forward. Sitting, folding our hands, blaming it all to the government of the day is not going to help us. But from now on, having sat in this sitting, we need each other more than before. Maybe a little bit of a background of myself. I don't have a matric, if I can begin there. I only had an opportunity of attending matric for one day in 1980, where a lot had to happen from what the doctor has just said here. And I was one of those people who had to heed to the call, which was popular then, a call for freedom now, education later. With the hope that when we are free, we will cover for the time and education that we sacrificed by free compulsory education for all, which has not happened for the past 20 years. But I don't think we are here to talk about that, because we have talked about that at length. We need to do something about that. We need to do something about that. As of our movement, or maybe I should explain this to you guys. You will find me speaking more in a way of a collective, a we and us, as opposed to them and they. In a movement where everything is done in a collective, you will find it very rare for the members there to express themselves as individuals. And that is the cornerstone of sustaining a movement, a collective. In such a way that it has become a practice, a normal practice, daily practice in our movement, that even if we sit for meetings, we have general meetings, we have executive meetings, we have meetings that you may think of in a formation of that nature. Even if we're coming to sit at a meeting, it has become a policy to the movement that there shouldn't be a policy drafted by an individual that has to be tabled. Because immediately, if an individual has to draft a policy for a meeting, that meeting belongs to that individual. And all other people in that meeting are going to be passive onlookers. So it has become a rule that whenever we attend a meeting as a movement, there has to be an agenda which is set by the people. Leaders can only suggest items to the agenda. And that is where we begin democratizing our practices in our formations, which is very important. So I'm here to talk about living politics. In a political social movement of ours, others would wonder, why do we refer ourselves to a political social movement? It is because whatever crime that is committed on us is politically motivated. So it is necessary for us to respond in responses that are politically motivated. So the concept of living politics in our formation will mean that we learn as we go. There is no certain individuals who sit and think for the people. We learn as we go in our daily struggles together. And that helps us a lot to sustain the movement, the togetherness of the people with different ideas who agree to disagree up until they agree on one point to take it forward. And that is the democratic process that we think everyone else might benefit out of, because we have acknowledged that democratic processes are very slow and boring. and the price one needs to pay if you want to practice democracy, not theorize, but practice democracy, the price you must be prepared to pay is time. You must not be a person who wants to do things hastily. I want results now. Because we don't have the same level of thinking. Others think faster, others think slower. I'm talking about the reality that happens in the formations down there at the grassroots. So if you happen to be a leader in that scenario, you have to be more patient. Wait until everybody understands the idea we put forward, so that everybody owns the idea. And when everybody feels owning the idea, whatever resolutions are going to be taken are going to be protected by everybody. And that takes time. And that takes time. Right now, the talk in the air is about the students from Cape Town and maybe Rhodes. The general talk in the public outside at the grassroots is, what is going into the heads of these people? We have sent them to universities to study, and now they are talking about the stages that must go. Is that the transformation that we want? To us, as a movement, we understand what is happening because we have been in the game for longer. But for the general public, they don't even understand what is happening. And yet, you guys, you need the buy-in of the majority of the people down there. So the ball is in your court, if we can make an example, to educate the masses at the grassroots of what is happening, of what the intentions are, if we are more serious about the transformation of our lives in society. So that is one example I'm going to make, that people down there are waiting for you guys to come and educate. Educate, not in the form of education between the four walls where there is a desk and a teacher, but to sell your ideas because you are exposed to higher levels of education, so that you can be able to link your struggles with the masses. To give your struggles a social muscle. Because without a social muscle, your struggles are going to be a theory. Just a theory which will never materialize to something that will be of help to the whole nation. So as Abahlali baseMjondolo, we practice collectivism to the extreme. And that is why we have come to realize that not only the South African government, but any other government that you may think of. I've had an opportunity to be in Italy, to be in Sweden, in Germany. When you speak to the grassroots, you will be amazed to find that even in those countries that we perceived to be fully developed, treat the grassroots in the same way as the South African government. So the struggles are the same, which tells us that we need the academic world to come join hands with us, the grassroots, to take this country forward. I wish to stress something here. When we speak of a collective, it becomes very difficult. If I can be frank with you, when I joined Abahlali in 2009, coming from a background of radio, community radio station, I thought everything was going to be easy, but it took me 2.5 years to understand a we and us. A period of 2.5 years to understand the processes, decision making, and everything else in this formation. Because in a real movement where there is democracy, a we and us is in practice. And when you have to practice something, that is where you get exposed of your inner thoughts. So you can't fake it. You can't fake it. You can hide it inside, but when you have to practice it, it has to be real. So this is what has helped us to sustain our movement for a period of 10 years. Being honest to one another, an element of trust, a will to actively participate in whatever is being carried out. That is the reflection of who and what we are. And I liked it when it was touched on that we need the academia to come to us in order to assist us in empowering us as a society. If I can make an example, to us, you guys are like in the olden days. You are like the people who leave their homes, go to Joburg and work in the mines, and are expected to come back and bring money to improve lives of the people at home. But it is not easy. That is not going to be easy for you guys to do that, like what the gentleman at the back has said. It is two different worlds that talks different languages. And we need first to understand one another, our areas of operating. And without us, I don't think you will be something. And without you, I don't think we are going to be anything. So I'm hoping that today's session is not going to be a once-off thing. It's going to be something that is going to be ongoing. Because the people out there are living real life and they are dying because of lack of knowledge. You know, when we speak of poor people, many of the middle class and other societies merely associate poverty with lacking money. That's not the case. Being poor does not mean that I do not have money. Lack of knowledge, to make an example, is quite dangerous. And if you can afford us with knowledge, empower us with knowledge of how to do things, that is gold to us. That is gold to us. And also, I think we must be able to define, to give an exact definition of what politics are. If there can be somebody who can define what politics are, not according to what the dictionary tells us, but in the real world. Because you'll find people quickly saying, oh, he's saying this because he's just employed cheap politics. And you end up not knowing exactly which is the rich politics and the cheap politics. And also, I put it upon yourselves to help us understand what politics are. Because at the grassroots, we only understand politics as taking care of my opponents. If somebody appears to be opposing what I want to be done, I must find a way of getting rid of them. And that is perceived to be politics down there. And your hand in that also is asked for. to assist us with knowledge. To assist us with knowledge. If I have to speak about political assassinations that you read about in newspapers, that you watch about on televisions, they are for real. You know, organizing a society before 1994 is the same as organizing a society post-1994. It means real death. It means real death, of which we are currently confused as to what has gone wrong. What is it that we are doing wrong? Because there is little difference. Of course, many people will differ with me in a debate when we speak about. There's a little difference between the olden days, before 1994, and after 1994. And that can only be realized when you speak to the grassroots. When you try and see things through an ordinary man in the streets. Why can't we feel freedom? Why can't we feel free? Is it necessary to be bussed to a sports ground to be told that you are free? That is why we don't recognize Freedom Day. Because we were never free from 1994 forever. And that is why we have decided to do something about our own lives, which the government authorities do not like. And we have come to realize that not only South African government, but any government in the world, what they cannot control, they destroy. Where are we headed to? Where are we headed to? We have a constitution, which by all means is on the side of the poor, and whatever decision is made by the Constitutional Court or whatever competent South African court in favor of the poor people is never implemented by those who are meant to implement it. The very same constitution is being undermined by the people who are supposed to be the custodians of the constitution. They are first in line to, I wonder how I can put it. They are first in line to defy it. What can you do in that situation as an ordinary man in the street? I'm going to repeat myself here and say, when people see us protesting in the streets, they regard us as the ungrateful black South Africans, if I can put it that way. Forgetting that there is a series of attempts made before taking it to the streets. And that is not known to the entire society. So for us as a movement, to try and show a South Africa that is not read about in newspapers, that is not watched on television, it means death. Can you guys come to the rescue of the grassroots? Because that is where you come from. That is where you need to go back to and put things right, because you are enlightened. You are enlightened more than us. We know what we want. The only thing that is lacking is how do we get to acquire that. So I should say we need to develop an element of trust. Because we at the grassroots, as illiterate as we are, we don't have the trust for the learned people. You know the reason why? It's because the people who are educated do not use their education to assist those who are not educated. They make use of that same education to deprive the uneducated of whatever positions they have and justify that, making use of the very same laws and the Constitution. And it becomes a confusion to the grassroots. You stand a chance of putting the record straight in order to gain that element of trust as the educated people in our society. In October this year, our movement will be celebrating the 10th anniversary, which has been a daunting task for those who have been in the membership since 2005. It has not at all been a smooth sailing, as is the case with any other social movement, because we are being honest with this. We don't claim having membership of every Shangwela. There are settlements that we do not have membership in, but we have the same cause. Are you going to give yourselves time to try and understand why people live in those conditions? Because there's a thin line that separates the grassroots and the educated societies. Not going to talk about the middle class. I'm not going to talk about the middle class. I'm going to talk about the people who are going to come out of the universities educated, empowered, equipped to change things around from where they come from. So I'm going to say, guys, the ball is in your court. We want the kind of freedom to control our lives in democratic practices. In democratic practices. That's what we want. Because when democracy is practiced, even if I'm not educated, I am going to have my space in society uninvaded. So, we want you guys to understand that there is a need for you to come down to the grassroots and link whatever struggles that you have with us down there, make us understand what is happening. Because the institutions of this nature before were used to be places where foundations were laid. Foundations of anything you may think of. But it changed with time. But the hope is coming back now. We can see that you are now questioning the existence of the Cecil John Rhodes statue. Our hopes are now beginning to come back. Now we can think of you as people who might be on our side in understanding what our cries are. I think I should end there for now, because I enjoy this more when we talk, when there's questions to be asked and answers to be given. Hoping that the background I've just given has given you guys some substance to talk about. I should end just there. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got about half an hour before lunch. So, questions to both or either? Yes.